The ER at St. Michael's in Savannah smelled like antiseptic and failure. Brooke Sullivan moved through it like a ghost, efficient, precise, never making eye contact with the doctors who controlled everything with a glance and a signature. Her scrubs were always perfectly pressed. Her dark hair pulled back so tight it might hurt. She documented vitals in handwriting so meticulous it looked like calligraphy, each number a small act of defiance against invisibility. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer overhead. Burned coffee mixed with the sharp sting of bleach from the supply closet. A ventilator wheezed its steady rhythm from Trauma Bay 3. These sounds were her language now. These sounds and the soft voice that never rose above a whisper when she asked patients to breathe deep, to hold still, to trust her hands. Nobody asked her name. She had worked at St. Michael's for 6 years, 4 months, and 17 days. She knew every hallway by the sound of her shoes on the tile. The echo pattern changed at the second-floor junction, quieter near the NICU where they kept the lights low and the voices low with it. She knew which supply closets had enough space to stand without feeling the walls close in. She knew that room 347 held a former Marine named Davis with a severe traumatic brain injury from an IED blast in Helmand Province, and that his left forearm bore her name tattooed in block military letters, Sullivan. She had carried him 2 miles through enemy territory during a firefight near Sanjin Valley. Now he looked right through her face every morning when she checked his oxygen saturation, his brain injury erasing the woman who'd saved his life. Her hands trembled for half a second when she saw that tattoo. Then they went still. The night shift had left the ER in its usual controlled chaos, 3 patients waiting for CT results, 2 more for discharge paperwork, 1 elderly man in bed 6 who kept asking for water even though his lips were already wet with it. The morning light filtered through windows that nobody ever cleaned, casting everything in a shade of institutional grey. Brooke moved from bed to bed, checking monitors, adjusting for drips, her movements precise as a surgical laser. A 22-year-old heroin addict in bed 2 had collapsed veins from 5 years of use, tracks running up both arms like a roadmap of destruction. The night shift nurses had tried twice. Failed twice. Her foresight was swelling, the first stick blown, the second one worse. "Let me," Brooke said. Not asked. Said. Her voice like a hand steady on a tiller. The heroin addict's eyes went wide. Most people looked at her like she was part of the furniture. This one looked like he'd just seen something rare. Something that might save him. She pulled out an 18-gauge needle. Angiocath. The steel glinted under the fluorescent lights. Her left hand found the inside of his left wrist, feeling for the vessel beneath the scarred skin. The vein was there, a thin, damaged, but present. Most nurses would have given up. Would have asked for a line through the foot. Would have called for the central access kit. Brooke inserted it on the first stick. The needle slid home like it had been waiting for her. A small hiss of blood into the chamber. The vein took the plastic catheter without complaint. She taped it down with the kind of care most people reserved for newborns, her fingers moving like they were doing something sacred. Because they were. Every successful line was a small resurrection. Every patient who didn't have to wait for access was a victory nobody counted. "How did you?" the heroin addict started. "You're stable," she said. "Saline lock. Pain management will be here in 5 minutes." She moved to the next bed without waiting for gratitude. Gratitude was a luxury she'd learned not to accept. It drew attention. It made people look at you. It made them ask questions. But the patient started requesting her by name. Room 4 wanted the quiet one. The elderly man in bed 6 said Miss Sullivan like it was a prayer. A woman post-op from gallbladder surgery specifically told the charge nurse she wanted Brooke handling her Foley catheter because she doesn't make you feel like you're a problem. The requests accumulated like snow, quiet, steady, relentless. Dr. Mercer noticed. He arrived for his shift at 6:36 a.m., exactly 7 minutes before official rounds began. His white coat was crisp enough to cut with a knife. His reputation preceded him like a shock wave, 3 nurses had transferred to other floors in 6 months, 1 had quit entirely and was now working at a private clinic in Charleston. He was the kind of doctor who made medical students second-guess their life choices. The kind of voice that filled a room without trying. He scanned the ER like a predator reading wind patterns, his eyes cataloguing staff, supplies, weaknesses. They landed on Brooke. She felt the weight of his attention like a hand on the back of her neck. She didn't look up from the medication cart. Her hands continued their steady work, drawing up 2 milligrams of midazolam into a 3 milliliter syringe, labeling it with the patient's name and time. Everything precise. Everything documented. Everything beyond reproach. Sullivan, Dr. Mercer said. Not a greeting. A statement of location. Doctor, she replied. The deferential nod of someone who knew exactly where they stood. Below him. Well below. He moved closer. She could smell his cologne, expensive, the kind that cost more than her monthly car payment. He watched her hands work. She was inserting a peripheral line into room 3, an 82-year-old man with pneumonia. Second-generation immigrant who spoke English with a heavy accent. The vein was difficult, age had made everything harder, more fragile, less forgiving. Brooke's needle found it anyway. First stick. The old man's face flooded with relief. Thank you, he said in Spanish-touched English. You are very good. Very careful. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. She saw it, a barely perceptible movement, the kind of micro-expression that most people missed. But Brooke had learned to read the smallest tells. In the mountains near Bagram, survival meant understanding what someone wasn't saying out loud. What their shoulders were saying. What their breathing pattern was broadcasting to anyone patient enough to listen. Dr. Mercer didn't like that the patient was grateful. Didn't like that it was directed at her. She turned back to her work, pulling off the latex gloves with a soft snap and disposing of them in the red biohazard bin. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like nothing had changed. Like something hadn't shifted. That night, alone in her apartment on the 2nd floor of a converted plantation house on East 49th Street, Brooke stood in front of her closet and reached for the jacket she'd bought at a military surplus store in 2008. It was faded army green, the color of dust and distance. Inside the left lining, sewn with stitches so small they were almost invisible, was a unit patch. She traced her finger across it the way some people pray. The patch was maybe 3 inches square. Faded now, the colors worn to ghost versions of themselves, a golden eagle superimposed over a dagger, some Latin word she no longer needed to translate. The Hindu Kush was written across it in thread that had once been vibrant. Now it looked like everything else from that life, like a memory fading into sepia. She had embroidered those letters herself during a rotation through FOB Shank in Loga province, stitching them during a sandstorm that lasted 17 hours, needles sharp enough to draw blood from her fingers, the pain a small payment for staying awake, for staying alive, for staying present in a place where absence was another word for death. Captain Brooke Sullivan. That was who she had been. The Pentagon had erased her on a Tuesday in June. Officially, she didn't exist anymore. Her records were sealed. Her citations filed under restricted access. Her orders were clear: never surface, never claim the service, never tell anyone what you did in the Hindu Kush. There had been an operation that went sideways. People had died. Not her fault, the debriefing officer said. But the operation was classified. Compartmentalized. Buried deep enough that even Congress wouldn't ask questions. She was a ghost now. The paperwork had made it official. Brooke pressed the patch against her palm. For exactly 4 seconds she let herself feel the weight of it, the loss, the erasure, the slow death of being unmade by the government you served. Then she folded the jacket and locked it in the small safe behind the false panel in her closet. The kind of safe that would survive a fire. The kind of safe that held evidence she had ever been anything other than a nurse. Her hands started to shake. She pressed them against her thighs and counted backward from 20 in the language she'd learned in Kandahar. By the time she reached 10, the shaking had stopped. By 5, she was breathing normally. Control was something you learned in special forces the way other people learn to tie shoes, automatic, essential, non-negotiable. She made tea. Chamomile. She sat on the small balcony that overlooked the street below. The Savannah night was thick and warm, smelling like river water and old money and Spanish moss hanging from oak trees like the ghosts of better centuries. A streetlight hummed its fluorescent prayer. A car passed, headlights cutting through the darkness. Room 347 held a man who used to know her name. She had seen the tattoo on his forearm the first day she was assigned to his care, her name written in block military letters by someone who wanted to remember her even if she was trying to forget. Sullivan. Like a prayer. Like a plea. His brain injury from the blast had taken everything except that tattoo. He didn't remember the fight. Didn't remember her carrying him 2 miles through territory controlled by people who would have killed him slowly just to make a point. His eyes looked right through her every morning when she checked his oxygen saturation, his pupils dilating appropriately to light, his breathing steady at 14 breaths per minute. He was healing. Eventually he would transfer to a rehab facility. Eventually he would start a new life that didn't include memory of the woman who'd saved his. That was mercy, Brooke thought. That was the kind of grace you couldn't pray for. That just happened to you if you were lucky enough to survive your own past. The next words out of Dr. Mercer's mouth would change how she understood that mercy entirely. Grand rounds. 20 residents and attending physicians seated in tiered rows of the conference room at St. Michael's, their coffee cups steaming in the fluorescent light. Dr. Mercer stands at the podium with a remote in his hand, and he clicks. Brooke's chart notes appear on the screen behind him, her precise handwriting enlarged to the size of billboard text. Her assessment of a patient with acute respiratory decline. Her documentation of subcutaneous emphysema. Her differential diagnosis written in the clean, economical language of someone trained to communicate in conditions where words were currency and silence was safety. This, Dr. Mercer announces, his voice dripping with theatrical disappointment, is what happens when we let technicians play doctor. He reads her notes aloud. Not respectfully. In a mocking sing-songy voice that turns her clinical observations into a parody, each medical term elongated like a child's impression of an adult. The residents snicker. One of them actually hides his face behind his coffee cup. Mercer pauses for effect, letting the laughter settle like sediment, then leans back against the desk with the ease of a man whose power is so absolute he doesn't need to fight for it. Note the adorable attempt at medical terminology, he continues. Decreased breath sounds. Subcutaneous emphysema. How precious. Perhaps the mute would like to present her differential diagnosis to the room. He looks toward the back wall where Brooke stands because protocol requires nurses to attend grand rounds and protocol also requires them to be silent and invisible. Her jaw tightens. A small movement. A half-second contraction of muscle that might have been a swallow or might have been rage compressed into something her body could contain. Her hands are clasped in front of her scrubs. Her eyes are fixed on a point 6 inches above his head, a technique she learned years ago when officers would berate soldiers during formation, look past them, never at them, never give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't defend herself. She doesn't speak. The silence stretches. It becomes uncomfortable. The residents look at their hands. An attending suddenly finds his notes fascinating. Mercer's smile hardens into something uglier because he wanted a reaction and got nothing, wanted her to crumble and got composure, wanted her to break and got her turning it into a kind of armor that no amount of mockery could penetrate. He laughs, a sharp, aggressive sound, and moves on to the next case, but his eyes track her as she remains motionless against the wall. Later that afternoon, the break room near the medication dispensary. The vending machine hums its monotonous electric song. Brooke reaches for a ginger ale at 1:08 p.m., her hands moving with the same precision she brings to every task. Dr. Mercer enters with 2 other attending physicians, laughing about something, and he sees her but doesn't acknowledge her. Instead, he speaks loud enough for the entire nurses' station to hear, his voice carrying through the break room like broadcast news. Does anyone know if the mute has forgotten how to speak? His colleagues shift uncomfortably, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Or just never learned. I'm genuinely curious if it's trauma or just limited cognitive capacity. Brooke is 3 feet away, restocking the crash cart with medications she's checked 3 times already. Epinephrine in proper sequence. Atropine. Amiodarone. Her hands continue their work without pause, organizing medications in perfect alphabetical order, her face showing absolutely nothing. Not anger. Not hurt. Not the trembling that would come later when she's alone in her apartment, when she touches the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining and her hands finally shake from the effort of restraint. Here, in this moment, she is a sculpture made of scrubs and silence. One of Mercer's colleagues actually says, "Come on, man," but it's weak, meaningless, and nobody follows it. The uncomfortable laughter dies. Brooke finishes the crash cart and moves to the next task as if he's speaking a language she doesn't understand. The afternoon shift brings a dialysis patient into the ER with a blown fistula and 0 viable access points. Mercer's team has tried twice already, 2 failed attempts at the femoral vein that left the patient bruised and terrified and running out of options. The patient's potassium is climbing. His fluid status is critical. He needs dialysis in the next 6 hours or his organs start to fail. Mercer approaches the bed with his residents trailing behind like remoras following a shark, and after examining the patient, he announces to the room that they're sending him to interventional radiology for a central line placement. Standard protocol. Safe protocol. Slow protocol. Brooke is passing with a fresh for setup, and she pauses. Her hands know what her voice can't say. She knows the patient is already compromised. She knows interventional radiology is backed up. She checked the board 3 times during her shift because her mind works in logistics and preparation, the way a soldier's mind works when the difference between lives and deaths is sometimes just one calculation made correctly. "May I try?" The words come out quiet. Respectful. A question, not a statement. Mercer's eyes narrow. Absolutely not. You. She doesn't wait for permission that was never going to come. She approaches the patient's arm with the kind of focused calm that comes from having done something correctly under conditions that were exponentially worse than this, from having placed 4s while incoming fire kicked dirt around her position, while people were screaming, while her own blood was dripping onto the patient's skin. This is a dialysis fistula in a hospital with working lights. This is the easy version of this problem. The needle goes in clean. First stick. The blood flows dark and perfect into the 4 line. The patient exhales in relief. Mercer's face goes crimson. Not a flush. Not a blush. A sudden complete filling of blood vessels with pure rage, the color of something overheating, something about to fail. He steps close, invading her space, his breath smelling like mint gum and coffee, and he says the words that are designed to be a final ending, a full stop on her presence in this hospital. "You just practiced beyond your scope," he says, his voice low and controlled and infinitely more dangerous because of it. That's medical decision-making. That's a physician's responsibility. "I'm calling security right now to escort you out." His hand is already reaching for his phone, his fingers moving with the absolute certainty of someone who believes the rules are a weapon he owns. This is insubordination. This is a violation of your license. Her fingers continue taping down the 4 site with perfect precision. The tape adheres smoothly. The 4 is secured. The patient will live. Her hands don't shake. Her voice doesn't break. She simply finishes the task, turns back to her patient without acknowledging that Dr. Mercer exists in any meaningful sense, and checks the flow rate with the kind of methodical attention she brings to everything. His hand tightens on the phone. She can feel his rage like heat coming off asphalt, but she has spent 18 years in conditions where rage was background noise, where she learned that the most powerful response to an enemy is to make them irrelevant through the simple act of continuing to do your job while they scream. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 hours later, at 2:38 p.m., the ER doors explode inward with the force of a body moving without restraint. Security breach. The kind of thing that wasn't supposed to happen at St. Michael's, where bad things happen to other hospitals, other cities, other people's shifts. A man enters. 300 pounds minimum, muscles built on pharmaceuticals and rage, his right hand gripping a Glock 19 with the loose confidence of someone who hasn't actually used it but believes it makes him powerful. His other arm shows track marks from years of use, and his eyes have the wild diameter of someone running on adrenaline and desperation. He fires once into the ceiling at 2:13 and 13 seconds. The acoustic tile explodes into white powder. The shot echoes off linoleum and steel and the thin metal panels of the 4 stands. The sound is louder than anyone who hasn't experienced it expects, louder than movies, louder than training scenarios, loud enough to break something in the part of people's brains that recognizes safety. Oxycodone now or everyone dies, he screams, and the ER dissolves into chaos. Patients scatter like startled birds. A mother grabs her child and shoves them under a gurney. A pregnant woman in triage starts to hyperventilate, her hand moving to her belly, her entire body shaking with the knowledge that she's trapped between a threat and the only exit. Staff freeze or scatter. One nurse drops a tray of instruments and the metal clatters across the tile like secondary gunfire. 2 security guards who'd been lounging near the main desk suddenly become invisible, crouching behind the counter, their hands shaking too badly to reach for anything that might help. Brooke is at the medication dispensary 20 feet away, and her body goes completely still. Not frozen. Still. Her eyes track his stance, his grip, the way his finger rests on the trigger with too much pressure, amateur pressure, the kind that comes from fear rather than training. She recognizes it in the set of his shoulders, the jerky way his arm swings around the ER. This is someone who's never actually killed before. All rage. No muscle memory. Just desperation and the belief that a gun is a solution to a problem that it actually made worse. Dr. Mercer freezes in the center of the ER near one of the exam beds, and the gunman crosses the distance in 4 strides. Fast. Determined. He grabs Mercer by the throat, the sound of flesh meeting muscle sharp and terrible, and presses the barrel of the Glock against his temple with enough force that the skin dimples inward. "You're a doctor, right?" Saliva flies from the gunman's mouth. "Get me the oxycodone or I blow your brains across this floor right now." Mercer's face drains to the color of old plaster. His strategic mind, the one that manipulates policy and weaponizes hierarchy and understands institutional power, suddenly encounters a problem that doesn't care about his credentials or his connections or his ability to make phone calls. He stammers about protocols and locked cabinets and procedures. The words don't matter. The gunman's attention swings wildly, paranoid now, scanning the ER, looking for threats, seeing ghosts in every shadow. The pregnant woman whimpers. A small sound. Terrified. The gunman's gun swings toward her, away from Mercer's head, his finger tightening slightly on the trigger as he registers her as a secondary threat, a complication, something that needs to be managed. Brooke moves. No thought. No hesitation. No calculation. Muscle memory from the Hindu Kush, from Kabul, from a dozen situations where the difference between living and dying was the ability to recognize a threat and close the distance before the threat could become active. She covers 8 feet in less than 2 seconds, her body moving with the terrifying fluid precision of something operating on a completely different processing speed than normal people. She recognizes the amateur stance, the telegraphed movement, the way his elbow starts to extend, and she uses a joint lock she learned from a special forces instructor, controlling the wrist, leveraging his weight against the geometry of his own arm. The gun comes up. She twists. His arm talks. The sudden pain of his shoulder joint approaching its limits registers in his face a split second before his body follows the physics of the lock and impacts the ground face first with the full weight of his 300-pound body. The Glock skitters across the floor toward the waiting area. For seconds. Total time from movement to ground impact, for seconds flat. 2 security guards who'd been crouching behind the desk finally find their courage and rush forward with zip ties. They secure his hands while he's still stunned, still trying to understand how the floor became his reality so suddenly. The ER becomes a space of shocked silence. Everyone is staring at the quiet nurse who just dropped a man twice her size like he was nothing, like she'd been waiting for something to finally give her permission to be what she actually was. Brooke steps back from the gunman's prone body. Her hands are perfectly steady. Her breathing is controlled. She looks at the pregnant woman to confirm she's physically intact, then at Mercer, who's sitting on the ground with his back against the exam bed, his face the color of old newspaper, his hands shaking so badly they blur. She doesn't speak to him. She simply turns back to her patient, the one who's been waiting for dialysis, the one who's for she placed despite everything, and checks his vitals with the same methodical precision she brings to everything. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her hands don't tremble. Her voice doesn't crack. She just resumes work, checking the patient's fluid status, confirming the foreplacement is still secure, her entire presence suggesting that taking down armed gunmen is simply another part of a 12-hour shift at St. Michael's. One of the residents whispers something to another resident. Mercer is still on the ground, still processing what he just witnessed. And Brooke continues doing what she's always done, saving lives, helping the suffering, and existing in the space between visibility and ghosts. The ER doors burst open at 2:27 p.m. 300 pounds of muscle and methamphetamine, boots thundering against tile like distant artillery. The man's eyes were wild, unfocused, his right hand gripping a Ruger 9mm with the loose confidence of someone who'd never actually pulled a trigger before. His left hand swung the weapon upward, and the ceiling erupted. The shot shattered a recessed-like fixture. Glass rained down like ice. Plaster dust drifted through the fluorescent glow like snow. Oxycodone. His voice cracked, desperate and sharp. I want oxycodone or I start putting holes in people. The ER scattered. Nurses dropped clipboards and ran. A resident fumbled with her phone. Dr. Mercer, standing near the nursing station reviewing a chart, took exactly 2 steps backward before the gunman's eyes locked onto the white coat, authority, a target, leverage. The man grabbed Mercer by the collar and spun him around, pressing the barrel hard against his temple. Mercer's face went white. His mouth opened. No sound came out. You're going to get me oxycodone, the gunman hissed, his breath smelling like copper and gasoline. You're going to do it right now or I paint the walls with this guy's brain. Mercer's eyes rolled upward, trying to see the gun. His hands trembled at his sides. His breath came in short, panic gasps. This was not a man accustomed to having his life in someone else's hands. The calculation and confidence that had carried him through 2 decades of medicine had become a liability. He was just a target now. Just meat between the gunman and whatever he wanted. Brooke was standing 7 feet away, near the trauma bay doors, holding a patient's chart. She watched the gunman's stance. His weight was on his back foot, classic untrained posture. His grip on the Ruger was loose, the muzzle wavering slightly from Mercer's temple. His breathing was rapid and shallow. He'd never done this before. The difference between someone who'd actually killed and someone who'd never fired a gun outside a range was written all over his body in muscle tension and eye movement. Then his head snapped toward the maternity ward hallway. A pregnant woman had stepped out of the imaging clinic, 5 months along, completely unaware of what was happening 30 seconds away. The gunman's face twisted. His eyes went hard. I'll do it, he screamed at the pregnant woman. I'll do all of you. He swung the weapon toward her. Muscle memory didn't wait for permission. Brooke moved like something made of applied physics. Not running, gliding. 14 years of CrossFit and PT in a military gymnasium translated into pure economy of motion. Her right hand came up and found his wrist in the exact moment he was committed to the swing. Pivot. Rotation. The joint lock she'd learned in a compound near Kabul, drilling it 10,000 times until her nervous system owned it more completely than her conscious mind. For seconds. That's all it took. Wrist rotation. Elbow extension. The gunman's body followed his arm because the human skeleton has no choice. Leverage is leverage, whether you're 19 years old or 70. His grip involuntarily opened. The Ruger clattered against the floor. His feet left the ground and his momentum carried him face first into the tile, and Brooke's knee was already there, already positioned, already controlling the outcome before his brain could send panic signals to his extremities. He wasn't dead. He wasn't even seriously injured. But he wasn't getting up either. Brooke stepped back. Her hands were steady. Her breathing controlled. Her jaw didn't even clench. She turned to the pregnant woman. "You're okay." The woman nodded, her hands going to her belly, eyes wide. Brooke looked at the gunman, who was gasping and whimpering on the floor, his right arm bent at an angle that meant several bones had made noise on the way down. She glanced at Mercer, still frozen near the nursing station, his white coat torn at the collar, his face the color of spoiled milk. She looked back at her chart as if nothing had happened. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the room exploded. Someone screamed. Someone else called 911 again, reporting the gunman on the ground, the weapon secured, threat neutralized. A security guard appeared from somewhere, followed immediately by 2 more. They moved the gunman, cuffed him, read him his rights in voices that sounded surprised to still be alive. Mercer walked away while they were still securing the scene. He didn't thank Brooke. He didn't acknowledge what she'd done. His white coat was disheveled, his tie twisted, his composure shattered like the light fixture. But his mind was already moving. She could see it in his eyes, the calculation starting immediately, the shame transmuting into something else. Anger. Strategy. The need to regain control. He walked directly toward the administrative hallway. Brooke continued with her patient chart, documenting vitals from the morning, her pen moving in clean, precise lines across the paper. Her fingers didn't shake. Her breathing stayed controlled. Inside her chest, something had awakened, the same feeling that came right before a patrol, right before the doors kicked in, right before everything got loud and fast and real. But her face showed nothing. Her body showed nothing. She was a ghost again, invisible, already fading back into the background while the ER reorganized itself around the violence. It took 37 minutes. That's when the charge nurse found her near the supply closet restocking trauma trays. "Brooke, they need you in the administrative office. Now." The security guard met her in the hallway. His name tag said Rodriguez. He'd worked at St. Michael's for 4 years and had always nodded at her during shift changes. Today he wouldn't make eye contact. "We need to collect your personal items," he said quietly. She already knew. The lock room smelled like industrial disinfectant and old coffee. Her locker held the uniform jacket, navy blue, with a faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the kind of detail no one at St. Michael's would ever see. A spare pair of scrubs. Her personal stethoscope, the Littman cardiology model she'd bought with her first paycheck as captain 11 years ago. A photograph of a sunset over Helmand Province that she'd torn from a magazine and taped to the inside of the door. A trauma shears she'd carried since 2008. Everything fit in a cardboard box that used to hold 1,000 units of IV start supplies. "I'm sorry," Rodriguez said. He actually sounded like he meant it. "But I have my orders. Your shift is terminated effective immediately. Your patient assignments have been redistributed." Brooke didn't ask questions. She didn't argue. She just packed the box while her hands remained steady, while her breathing stayed controlled, while the ghost inside her chest remained perfectly, completely still. The charge nurse, Sarah, who'd worked beside her for 214 shifts across for years, walked past the break room without looking in. Their eyes were supposed to meet. They always met during shift changes. Today Sarah stared at the floor tiles like they contained secrets from God. The parking lot was 102 degrees under Savannah humidity. The asphalt was soft enough to leave footprints. Brooke set the cardboard box on the front seat of her 2008 Toyota Camry and sat with the door open, watching the heat shimmer rise off the hood like ghosts ascending. By 7 p.m., Mercer had made 3 phone calls to hospital systems across Georgia. His voice was a masterpiece of regretful concern, each word precisely calculated to plant doubt like seeds. She was unstable. Dangerous. She'd physically attacked someone today. Reckless vigilante behavior. What if the gunman had fired? What if her actions had gotten people killed? He documented everything. He was sending emails. He was building a narrative where he was the responsible physician protecting patient safety, and she was the liability that nearly got them sued into bankruptcy. That night, Brooke sat in her apartment, a one-bedroom in a converted warehouse that cost $800 a month and contained almost nothing of her except the books and the cardboard box from work. She pulled out the faded unit patch. It was smaller than her thumbnail, worn soft from handling, the Special Forces crest faded to almost nothing. The cloth itself had come from the lining of a jacket she'd worn in Kandahar province, the same jacket she'd been wearing the night they extracted 12 hostages under fire and the Pentagon decided she'd become more valuable as a ghost than as a soldier. She traced the outline with her index finger, remembering the Pentagon officer's voice in that grey room in Arlington. The operation in Hindu Kush never happened. Captain Sullivan never existed. Your records are sealed, your citations classified. Your orders are clear, never surface, never claim your service, disappear. 26 years old. Stupid enough to believe the right thing mattered. She put the patch back inside the jacket lining and locked it in her closet, where her hands couldn't find it every night, where the trembling wasn't fear, where it was just the weight of knowing exactly what she was capable of and exactly how little it had changed. The ER would forget her by next week. A new nurse would take her assignment rotation. The story of the gunman would fade into hospital legend the day someone stopped a shooting, but no one would connect it to the quiet woman who used to change fours without asking questions. By tomorrow morning, she would be nothing again. Already dead, already erased, already the ghost the Pentagon had made her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that the restraint she'd shown, the way she'd disarmed a 300-pound gunman with her hands and then simply walked away, that composure, that control, was the only thing keeping her from becoming exactly what the government had trained her to be. And somehow, Dr. Mercer was about to find out why the Pentagon buried her so carefully. Dr. Mercer moved like a man who'd just understood the rules of the game had changed. The gunman was already unconscious, zip-tied, bleeding from a cut above his eye where Brooke's forearm had caught him during the takedown. Security was already moving him toward the holding area. But Mercer didn't call for a stretcher or check on the hostages he'd been used as a shield to protect. He walked directly to the administrative phone in the trauma bay, his fingers steady, his jaw set with the kind of precision that came from knowing exactly which dominoes to push. 3 minutes later, the board president was listening to him describe Brooke's actions as reckless endangerment, vigilante behavior that violated every protocol, a liability that had nearly gotten staff killed when she decided to take matters into her own hands instead of waiting for trained security personnel. His voice carried the tone of a man protecting his institution, the concerned voice of leadership prioritizing staff safety over sentiment. It wasn't a request for her removal. It was a professional courtesy, a heads-up before the paperwork made it official. By the time he hung up, Brooke had finished her documentation on the gunman's vitals and was moving toward the next patient. She didn't acknowledge Mercer. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. She simply turned back to work as if the call had never happened, as if she hadn't just saved his life and he hadn't just repaid her with the administrative equivalent of a knife between the ribs. But the real work came in the next 90 minutes. Mercer pulled her from the schedule, removed her name from the ER rotation for the next 2 weeks, citing pending investigation into incident protocols. He sent a memo to every attending physician flagging her name with a yellow alert, patient care assistant under review for scope of practice violations. He filed paperwork with the state nursing board requesting an emergency credential review, the document citing her unauthorized performance of a medical intervention beyond her training level. He didn't mention that her intervention had stopped a man from being shot. He mentioned only that she'd overstepped, that she'd acted without authorization, that proper channels had been available and ignored. The language was clinical. The intent was surgical. Security called her locker area at 1:19 p.m. Brooke was told she could collect her personal items, that she was being placed on temporary suspension pending the investigation, that someone would escort her to ensure protocol was followed. The escort was a guard named Raymond who'd had coffee with her 3 times in 6 months and wouldn't meet her eyes now. He stood 5 feet away while she opened her locker, the blue metal door swinging open to reveal her backup shoes, 2 protein bars, a pen, and a photograph of Kandahar that she'd kept in the back corner, the only image from her service that didn't have faces in it. She placed everything into the cardboard box Raymond offered. No trembling. No anger visible on her face. Just the careful, methodical process of removing herself from a place she'd been invisible in for 14 months. Her jacket came off the hook. The faded unit patch was still sewn into the lining, where her fingers could find it. She took it with her, placed it on top of the shoes in the box, and sealed that life away as if it weighed nothing at all. By 6 p.m., Mercer had made 4 phone calls. The first to Baptist Medical Center in Jacksonville. The second to Savannah Memorial across town. The third to a smaller system in Augusta. The fourth to a regional health network coordinator who knew his voice immediately. Each call began the same way: "I'm calling about a former employee, and I feel obligated to warn you." The words that followed were technically true but arranged like a loaded magazine. Unstable. Reckless. Prone to vigilante behavior. Endangered staff and patients. No formal charges yet, but he wouldn't recommend hiring her. The message was consistent: don't touch her. She's contaminated. She's dangerous. No one asked for specifics. No one requested documentation. The reputation had already been established in the space between his words, the implication that this was a professional courtesy, institution to institution, a warning from one competent administrator to another. By 8 p.m., the message had spread through the regional healthcare network like ink in water. At 2:16 a.m., Brooke sat alone in an empty Waffle House on Victory Drive. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly green hue, and the only other person in the building was a waitress named Cheryl who'd stopped trying to make conversation after the first hour. Her coffee had gone cold in a white ceramic mug, the surface covered with a film of congealed cream she hadn't stirred properly. Outside, the rain hammered against the plate glass window like applause for a show no one was watching. She stared at her reflection in the black glass. The woman looking back wasn't Brooke Sullivan anymore. The woman in that window was something the government had already killed, a ghost wearing scrubs, a disappeared person, a name erased from every database that mattered. Captain Brooke Sullivan didn't exist. The Pentagon had made sure of that. And now the hospital had made sure everyone else did too. Cheryl refilled her cup without being asked, setting it down with the kind of gentleness that came from recognizing someone at the absolute bottom of their descent. Brooke didn't acknowledge it. She just stared at her reflection, watching a phantom woman drink phantom coffee in a place where no one would ever look for her. The rain kept falling. The clock above the register read 3:14 a.m. But that wasn't the worst part. What Brooke didn't know was that the gunman being held in county detention was being beaten systematically by other inmates, broken ribs, pneumothorax building in his chest cavity, his oxygen saturation dropping into territory where brain damage became inevitable. What she didn't know was that St. Michael's ER was going to be understaffed tomorrow because of flu exposure in 3 of the regular nurses. What she didn't know was that someone, somewhere, was going to make a call to pull her back in just long enough to save his life again, and that when she did, the gunman would speak her code name loud enough for a Marine waiting for X-rays to hear it. Everything that had just been buried was about to surface. But at 3:22 a.m., Brooke simply sat in the Waffle House and watched her ghost self drink cold coffee, her hand sliding into her scrub pocket to find the faded unit patch, her fingers tracing the stitching that proved she'd once been someone. Captain. Soldier. Valkyrie. The patch was still there. The title was still real. The government couldn't erase that. It just took one prisoner being beaten nearly to death, and one hospital running out of nurses, and one moment where she'd have to choose between staying hidden and letting someone die. She chose wrong, of course. She chose him. The gunman was brought back to St. Michael's 2 days later under armed guard, his lung collapsed from a prison beating, his breathing shallow and desperate. Brooke was reinstated temporarily due to staffing shortages, the board president's apology still hanging unsigned on her personnel file when they wheeled him past her station at 6:44 a.m. She didn't hesitate. She didn't acknowledge the irony. Her hands moved like muscle memory resuming its rhythm, medication, monitoring, the precise choreography of keeping someone alive who'd tried to end her life. The needle decompression took 17 seconds. The hiss of air escaping the collapsed lung. His oxygen saturation climbing from 62 to 78 to 89. Stable. When his eyes cleared and he looked at her with sudden, terrified recognition, his voice came out fractured, "Valkyrie, you're Valkyrie." The room went dead silent. 3 nurses froze with their hands suspended in mid-motion. A medical resident's pen stopped moving across the chart. The words hung in the antiseptic air like a defibrillator paddle pressed to skin, life-changing, irreversible, impossible to unsay. A Marine waiting in the X-ray corridor overhearing those 4 words pulled out his phone with trembling hands. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of someone accessing classified memory, and what he read aloud made the morning shift stop breathing. Captain Brooke Sullivan, Silver Star for Valor, led extraction of 12 hostages under fire, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, decorated for actions beyond the scope of her assigned role, record sealed by JSOC clearance. He kept reading, his voice climbing, 2 Purple Hearts, commendation from 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, call sign Valkyrie, status changed from active to, the words cut off like severed cable as Dr. Mercer appeared at the corridor's far end, his face already flushed crimson, his hand raised as if to swat away a lie. That's fraud. She's a fraud. She forged those records. I already verified, I contacted the Pentagon myself, they told me she has no military file. His voice carried the particular desperation of someone watching his reality collapse in real time, the strategic mind that had methodically dismantled her career suddenly recognizing the trap he'd built around himself, the doors closing inward, the walls contracting. 2 men in dark suits emerged from the stairwell at that moment. Not hospital security. Not administrators in borrowed authority. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of federal agents, their credentials held open like weapons that didn't fire bullets. The Pentagon liaison followed behind them, a woman with colonel's insignia who saluted Brooke with her fist pressed to her chest, not casual, not performative. A salute like a soldier honoring a fallen comrade who'd somehow managed to stand back up. Behind them came a 3-star general whose presence made the air pressure in the corridor change, made the fluorescent light seem dimmer by contrast, made everyone instinctively step backward and form a space around him as if magnetism itself was pushing them away. The general looked at Brooke, and his jaw tightened. He'd never met her before. He didn't need to. The recognition was institutional, the kind that came from classified files and sealed operations and the particular sacrifice of people who'd been ordered to disappear. He saluted her. A 3-star general, saluting a nurse in scrubs with a faded unit patch visible in her pocket. The gesture lasted 3 seconds. It felt like history reversing course. One of the suits turned to Dr. Mercer, whose hands were already rising in a defensive gesture, his mouth opening to construct justifications that would crumble before they finished forming. "Dr. James Mercer?" The agent's voice was flat as asphalt. "We need to talk about your attempts to access sealed military records through hospital personnel databases. We need to talk about your contacts with state licensing boards under false pretenses. We need to talk about the federal databases you accessed without authorization on January 14th, 16th, and 19th. Mercer's face went from crimson to the color of spoiled milk. "I was protecting patient safety. This is a misunderstanding." "I had no way to know," the second agent cut him off with the efficiency of someone who'd heard every variation of this excuse 1,000 times. "You attempted to erase an active military asset. You triggered automatic security alerts when you tried to access her records. You've been under investigation for 6 days. Every phone call recorded. Every email preserved. Every contact with those 3 hospital systems documented." The handcuffs came out like the final word in a sentence that had been building to this moment since the day Mercer first called her the mute at a vending machine. They clicked onto his wrists with the sound of a cell door closing, the sound of consequence finally arriving. Security escorted him past the nurse's station where he'd mocked her about forgetting how to speak. Past the conference room where he'd used her chart notes as teaching examples of incompetence. Past the medication dispensary where he'd threatened to call security on her for overstepping her scope. The charge nurse who'd looked away when Brooke was fired now stood with her mouth open, watching the man who'd seemed untouchable reduced to a perp walk, his strategic mind finally failing him as the realization landed with crushing weight. He'd tried to erase someone the government had already made invisible, and the government did not appreciate that kind of interference. The FBI explained to hospital administration what had happened. Not with anger. Not with judgment. Just facts delivered with bureaucratic precision. Captain Sullivan's records weren't just sealed, they were actively monitored. Any access attempts were flagged as potential security breaches. Dr. Mercer's attempts to contact the Pentagon had triggered alerts in classified databases. The moment he tried to forge her personnel records through hospital systems, cameras started recording everything. The moment he contacted 3 other hospital systems to ensure she'd never work again, those calls were logged by federal servers. He'd essentially called law enforcement to report his own crimes while committing them. The board president arrived at 8:15 a.m., pale and already calculating damage control. She offered Brooke her position back immediately. Full back pay. Promotion to senior charge nurse if she wanted it. Restitution. An apology that sounded small and insufficient, like trying to measure an ocean with a cup. Brooke listened without nodding, without accepting, without acknowledging any of it. She was staring at the faded unit patch in her hand, the fabric worn soft from years of touching it in private moments, from tracing the outline during 3 a.m. shifts when the weight of invisibility pressed down so hard she could barely breathe. The general spoke quietly, meant only for her ears, his voice carrying the weight of institutional memory and classified knowledge finally allowed to breathe in daylight. The operation is declassified now, Captain. You can exist again. The words hit her like physical force. Her composure didn't crack. Her hands didn't shake. But her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall, her jaw clenching so hard the muscles worked visible along her temple. For the first time since she'd been ordered to disappear, someone with authority was giving her permission to come back. The patient in room 347, Davis with the traumatic brain injury and her name tattooed across his forearm from the firefight where she'd carried him 2 miles through enemy territory, was wheeled past on a stretcher headed for long-term care placement. His eyes focused with the uncertain clarity of someone whose neurons were slowly rebuilding connections. His damaged brain suddenly made one that mattered. Sullivan? Captain Sullivan. Recognition flickered across his face like a light switching on after years of darkness. He didn't understand the full context. The brain injury had taken most of his memory. But something had survived in the architecture of his mind. The woman who'd kept him alive in Sanjan Valley was the same woman standing in the corridor, except now she wasn't invisible. 6 months later, someone sent Brooke a photograph with no return address. The postmark showed it had been mailed from a distribution center 30 miles south of Savannah. Inside was a single image, Dr. Mercer standing in front of a strip mall classroom with beige walls and flickering fluorescent panels, teaching CPR to bored community college students who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. He was wearing a polo shirt with a community college logo stitched over the pocket. His medical license was gone. His authority was gone. His strategic mind had been reduced to demonstrating chest compressions to people earning minimum wage themselves, people who would never know he'd once commanded residents and threatened nurses and believed the world bowed to his credentials. His face in the photograph was aged a decade. The lines around his eyes looked like cracks. His hands demonstrated compression technique with the hollow precision of someone going through motions. $15 an hour. That was the sentence Dr. Mercer had received, not prison time, not even probation, but something that might have felt worse to someone like him, anonymity earned through failure, invisibility that came from irrelevance instead of heroism. Brooke looked at the photograph once. She filed it away in a drawer where she kept her old deployment insignia and the letters from soldiers whose lives she'd saved in the Hindu Kush. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel closure. She just felt like someone who'd been given permission to exist again, and that permission tasted like salt water and 3 a.m. realizations finally made real in daylight. She kept the faded unit patch in her scrub pocket now where her fingers could find it during long shifts, no longer hidden, no longer something to be ashamed of. The patch wasn't contraband anymore. It was proof that ghosts could come back to life if someone important enough gave them permission. During a quiet moment at the nurse's station, the charge nurse who'd turned away when she was fired asked softly what it was like, what combat was like, what being erased felt like, what it meant to carry a name that couldn't be spoken aloud. Brooke considered the question with the calm of someone who'd already survived worse than anyone needed to know. Her voice was still soft, but it no longer carried apology or fear. It was what it needed to be. Outside the hospital windows, Savannah humidity pressed against the glass like something alive, trying to get in. Ambulances arrived with their sirens cutting the morning air. The emergency department continued its endless rhythm of crises and recoveries, near deaths and second chances, the mundane and the miraculous happening simultaneously under fluorescent lights. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, not because she was weak, but because she'd already survived worse than anyone in that room could imagine, and silence was never surrender. It was just strategy. If you've made it this far, you know that the people we underestimate are often the ones we desperately need. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment below, what would you have done in Brooke's position? Tell us your story.